Tonight, the BC government rejects the Enbridges Northern Gateway project, saying the company has not been able to properly address environmental concerns. Is this the end of the line for Enbridge? What happens to the pipeline now? You're watching Top Story. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Top Story. My name is Aaron MacArthur. The provincial government has officially rejected Northern Gateway. After years of refusing to take a stand one way or the other in its final submission to the federal panel reviewing the pipeline, the provincial government says the plan does not address all of the many environmental concerns. We begin our coverage tonight with Brian Coxford.
It's been a $6 billion headache for British Columbians, dividing them along economic and environmental lines. It has pitted the feds against the province, oil interests against First Nations. Now, after years of wrangling, BC is saying no to the plan to bring Asian-bound oil from Alberta's tar sands through BC across the mountains to tankers in Kitimat.
We remain unconvinced that this project makes sense, that protects our environment and protects the taxpayers of British Columbia.
In its final submission to the National Energy Board panel reviewing the proposal, BC says Enbridge has presented little evidence about how it will respond in the event of a spill. The province is also unhappy with the Calgary-based company's apparent lack of interest in sweetening the deal financially for BC taxpayers. Conditions the Premier laid out several months ago as a precursor to continued negotiations. The final decision is up to Ottawa, but they seem to side with the province on this one.
Would you go over their heads and do the pipeline anyway?
No, we believe in waiting for the environmental assessment to come back and letting science drive this. And also, as I said, the conditions that the Premier has put forward, we agree with. These projects can't go forward without the public support, and the public support will never be behind these projects unless companies can demonstrate that they're being good stewards of the natural environment.
First Nations and environmental groups have been pushing the tide of opposition against the pipeline. The jobs are in the north, and the mayors up there believe this is just the beginning of tough negotiations to get a deal that's in the best interests of BC.
This is a hardball negotiation, and I think Enbridge really does need to find their way to the table with the Premier and figure this out.
The discussion needs to continue. Whether there's satisfactory answers coming back, that's, I guess, time will tell on that. And then we'll be able to determine from there whether more discussion could take place.
If Northern Gateway is to ever be built, Enbridge has to make big changes to its proposal environmentally and financially. It's not the end. The company says after the panel reports, it'll work hard to meet the conditions and earn the confidence of the government and the people of BC. Brian Coxford, Global News.
Janet Holder is the Executive Vice President for Enbridge of Western Access. Ms. Holder, thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome.
The opposition to Northern Gateway seems to be growing, and now that the BC government has come out against the project, is it time for Enbridge to rethink Northern Gateway?
Not at all. Actually, I would say that the opposition has not been growing. We actually are seeing more support for the project. And what has transpired today is actually the government of British Columbia's argument in the application that we have before the National Energy Board and basically the Joint Review Panel. So it is their recommendation or argument to the JRP on how they see the next phase or what should happen in their decision.
But even if the National Energy Board approves the project, does Enbridge really want to do business in a province that doesn't seem to want it?
I think that's what's maybe a mischaracterization, because we actually do see support for the project in the province, and I don't read the BC's argument today as being opposition. I think the BC government's been very clear that they have the 5 conditions. They want us to meet those 5 conditions. We believe those 5 conditions and support those 5 conditions, and we believe we can meet them. We have not met them today because the process would not put us in a place that we could meet them today. And primarily, what we're looking at is a stage in a project where we have spent close to $500 million on technical studies, geotechnical studies, marine studies, in trying to get us to this point, if we get a positive recommendation by the JRP, that does not give us permission to put a shovel in the ground and start constructing. That just says, okay, now you have to fulfill all these conditions, and these conditions, if you meet them, then you can start constructing. And even if we get permission to construct, it does not mean we have the right to operate. We'd have to fulfill a number of other conditions in order for us to operate. And those conditions will be, you know, in the neighborhood of about 200 of them. So this is not a blessing today, or expecting a blessing even at Christmas, that we get to go forward. We have a lot of work to do. We know that and understand that and expect that. And we want to work with the BC government and making sure that we meet their conditions as they see them.
Considering the outcome of the last election, the Liberals were really Enbridge's only hope of getting the pipelines, or at least approval from the province, to go forward. Disappointed with what the Liberals did today?
I think it's been misinterpreted what they did today. I think they have said to us all along that we have not met all their conditions, and we accept that and believe that. Use the example of emergency response plans. We do not have detailed emergency response plans. To get a detailed emergency response plans, we will actually be talking to all the first responders along the right-of-way. We'll be trying to understand what their capabilities are and what other capabilities they would like to have. In the detailed emergency response plan, we would actually have their phone numbers. So to do that work before we even know we have a project would not make a lot of sense, because the capabilities of these first responders will change through time. Their phone numbers will change through time. So the detail that we need to get to before we can actually construct and build, we understand we have to do, but it doesn't make sense for us to do that until we know we have a project before us. I sort of equate it to, the best way to know if we can build this in the way that anybody wants to see us to build it is actually build it. That's not an ideal outcome. We need to stage this and do it step at a time, and that's what we want to work with the BC government, and not just with the BC government, with the citizens of British Columbia and the Aboriginal groups, to continue to understand their issues and continue to progress this project.
All right, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. We're flat out of time. My thanks to Executive Vice President from Enbridge, Janet Holder, for being on the program tonight. Staying with Northern Gateway and looking at the environmental perspective of what happened today, we're joined in studio by Owen Madden with the Wilderness Committee. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Aaron. It's good to be here.
What do you make of what happened today?
Well, it's rare that you'll hear an environmentalist like myself agree with somebody from Enbridge, but there is a little bit of a misinterpretation of what happened today. Well, first of all, it's clear regular folks in BC do not want tar sands pipelines and tankers out here on the west coast. But today, nothing really changed. The decision rests with a few men sitting in Ottawa, federal ministers, Oliver and Kent, and the decision will rest with them still after today. The provincial government, it gave up that ability to make a decision on this pipeline back in 2010. So the situation hasn't really changed in that sense. It was an argument by the BC government. It reflected absolutely and very positively the fears that people have about pipelines and tankers, but the end decision still rests with Ministers Kent and Oliver and the Prime Minister.
I'll ask you the same question I asked Ms. Holder. Why would the federal government, why would Enbridge want to do business in a province that doesn't seem to want it?
Well, quite simply, the decision itself will rest with the people that they've influenced the most. Some of the mantra that's come out of the federal government has been very much influenced by the oil and gas companies. So they've got the right people in the right places. They know legally the decision will rest with the federal government. It hasn't changed, despite the fact that regular folk in BC are against tar sands pipelines and tankers. So I think they feel pretty well positioned today.
Janet Holder was also talking about support growing. Do you see that?
No, in fact, I read a poll quite recently, although after the BC elections, polls are a little bit hard to understand.
Hard to understand beforehand, too.
Yeah, exactly. But no, I mean, we've got 30,000 members. For many, many years now, we've had the same reply from our members when we've asked them. They are frightened by these tankers and pipelines because of the climate impacts, because of the risk of an oil spill. So we absolutely know that there are far more people in BC who do not want pipelines and tankers on their coast than there are that do want these projects.
The Environment Minister today was fairly clear. Enbridge has failed to assure the BC government they have the environmental wherewithal to deal with a spill. That's a positive step from the Liberal government, I would suggest.
Yeah, it absolutely is. It leaves the door wide open, of course, for there to be another staging of another event where the federal government comes to town and says, you know, we've got even better tanker safety provisions we can bring in. There's no way to avoid an oil spill if these projects proceed. The door is still wide open, and it will only be shut when Minister Lake or anybody else in the ministry decides we've got to get out of this equivalency agreement with the federal government, when we give away our ability to make this decision. I mean, for people to be threatened by this off here on the west coast, but for a small group of people in Ottawa to make this decision, it's very undemocratic. Even before last year, the National Energy Board, it had the final say on this, but then the federal government came along with Bill C-38 and said, no, we want to take that back.
And this is where you see the real problem lying, is just a decision centralized in the Prime Minister's office.
Absolutely. I mean, whether you're for oil or against oil, you'll always be for your democratic rights. We need Victoria to take that power back. We can then engage in a conversation about what a true independent hearing is in relation to these projects. They affect us for 20 years.
I can hear the business crowd already saying, you know, you're against pipelines, you're against jobs, you're against economic opportunities for BC. How does British Columbia get out from under a pretty slow economic time without these kinds of projects?
Yeah, well, there's ways, of course, of doing so. The world has to face a cleaner future than tar sands oil. It just contributes too much to climate change. Our main customers are making that shift right now. The equivalent of sticking with this stuff is like building telephone poles in an age when you know people are shifting to mobile phone technology. It's just backward. Now, we've got so much intelligence here in this province and further across Canada. We are the world's best when it comes to creating big infrastructure. We can create so much geothermal energy, so much clean options for us here. We've got so much options when it comes to hydro, wind, solar, you name it. We just need leadership. We certainly have the intellect, the ability to make that shift.
The environmental movement, though, is accused of wanting all these things and then stepping back from the edge when these projects get announced. I mean, I'm thinking Site C Dam, or there's any number of projects that are out there. Is there a happy medium there? I mean, we're getting a bit off topic, but
no,
it all relates.
It absolutely, it's all the same conversation. It's one of the reasons why I'm fighting for a Made in BC environmental assessment. They all should go through that process. It doesn't mean necessarily that these projects get held back for too long. It's a proper conversation that needs to happen. There are places where you put dams and there are places where you don't put dams. There's places where you put geothermal, etc., etc. Again, we have the ability to make these conversations, but the whole mantra here, the whole idea of what we're doing is being driven by the oil and gas companies. Renewables don't get the subsidies they need to even get ahead, but yet we know our customers have to shift to a cleaner future. We're supplying the wrong products here, and again, people here in BC, they're frightened by this prospect. They want a safer economic and environmental future.
The Liberals have left the door open for other heavy oil projects. This announcement today was just for Northern Gateway. The Kinder Morgan pipeline that goes into Vancouver, still the door's open for that. They've even still expressed support for the refinery that David Black wants to put into Kitimat. The two seem to be at odds.
I'd say that, you know, the time is right for the BC government to say, well, let's have a conversation about this. Again, the same rules apply. With Kinder Morgan, a small group of men in Ottawa will make that decision, far from the people who are deeply affected by it. So I will always accept, like any environmentalist should, that when society sits down and has a fair, objective conversation on whether or not this should happen, if that decision is yes, then we have to accept that. We live in a democracy. But that's not what's happening here. We want the government to be strong enough now. We want it to walk the walk, not just talk the talk, and create a Made in BC environmental assessment.
Do you see this as a turning point in the debate over heavy oil and oil sands? It seems like the momentum could go either way.
There has been a turning point of recent times. I don't think this is it. The turning point in recent times has come from the US. Unfortunately, people recognizing that some of the horrific things that are happening there with tornadoes, etc., are climate related. This project creates more climate change than we could ever face. It's 100 million tons of carbon. The whole province only creates 60 million tons. So the shift is happening naturally, if you will. Unfortunately, people suffer from that sort of a way of learning, but that's what's happening naturally. And we need to wake up and say, listen, we got to do cleaner products for the future.
And I suppose you'll keep the pressure on to make sure that this doesn't happen.
The fight is long.
All right. Owen Madden from the Wilderness Committee, thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you for having me here.
We're still lots more to come here on Top Story. The Integrated Homicide Investigation Team